Turn 4. Daytona International Speedway, February the 11th, 1994. A 47-year-old man loses control of his Chevrolet at nearly 190 miles an hour and slams almost head-on into the outside wall. He is pronounced dead a little over an hour later. Now here is what makes this crash different from almost anything else you will find in motorsport history. 4 years earlier, this exact same man woke up in a hospital bed and did not recognize his own wife's face. Doctors told him the injury that put him there had wiped out years of memory, and that if he had any sense at all, he would never climb into a race car again. He heard them. He believed them, even. And then he got back in the car anyway. This is the story of Neil Bonnett, the NASCAR legend who was warned, in the clearest possible terms, that racing could kill him and who died proving the warning right. Long before any of that, Neil Bonnett was just a kid from Hueytown, Alabama, growing up in the shadow of a group of racers who would eventually become one of the most legendary and one of the most tragically snake-bitten families in the entire sport. They called themselves the Alabama Gang. Bobby Allison, Donnie Allison, a driver named Red Farmer. And it was Bobby and Donnie Allison who first took a young, hungry Neil Bonnett under their wing and helped him find his way into a race car in the first place. Nobody involved in that early friendship could have possibly known just how much tragedy would eventually bind these men together, or how directly some of their fates would end up echoing each other. Bonnett's rise through the sport was fast, and it was real. By the late 1970s, driving for team owners like Jim Stacy and the legendary Wood Brothers Racing, he had established himself as one of the most dangerous men on any given Sunday. His first career win came in 1977 at Richmond. Over the course of an 18-year Cup Series career, he would go on to win 18 races total and grab 20 pole positions, numbers that put him firmly in the conversation among the sport's genuine greats. Not just a name fans remembered fondly, but a driver who could flat-out win. His best single-season finish came in 1985, when he finished fourth in the overall championship standings. He was not a footnote in NASCAR history. He was one of its stars, popular enough that Hollywood came calling too, casting him in small roles in racing films that introduced his face to people who had never even watched a Cup Series race. There was also a lighter, more good-natured side to Bonnett that fans genuinely loved, separate entirely from his talent behind the wheel. He had an easy, self-deprecating sense of humor and a thick Alabama drawl that made him a natural in front of a television camera long before anyone thought of him as a broadcaster. Teammates and rivals alike described him as one of the most well-liked men in the entire garage. Someone who could rib a competitor after a hard race and still be laughing about it with them an hour later. That likability is part of why, when things eventually went wrong for him, so much of the sport felt it personally, rather than simply reading about it as another name on a list of racing tragedies. But there was another pattern running underneath all of that success, one that would eventually define the entire second half of his life. Neil Bonnett got hurt, over and over again, in a way that even by the brutal standards of stock car racing in that era stood out. In 1987, he suffered leg injuries at Charlotte serious enough to threaten his entire career. Not long after that, he broke his sternum in a crash at Dover. By his own team's count, heading into the spring of 1990, it was already the fourth time in 5 seasons that Neil Bonnett had been hospitalized because of a racing accident. Anyone paying close attention could see where this pattern was heading. Nobody, including Bonnett himself, was ready for just how serious the next one would be. On April 1, 1990, during the Trans-South 500 at Darlington Raceway, Bonnett's Ford got caught up in a violent 13-car pileup. His car hit the wall driver's side first, and the impact left him with a severe head injury. What followed was not a normal recovery. Bonnett woke up with almost total amnesia. He did not know his own wife, Susan. He looked at friends and racing colleagues he had known for years, people who had been standing next to him in garages for over a decade, and had absolutely no idea who they were. His wife later described it in the simplest, most devastating way possible. She said that someone would have to tell him who a person was, and only then would he recognize them, and only for as long as that reminder lasted. This was not a man with a headache who needed a few days of rest. This was a man who had, in a very real sense, lost years of his own life in a single violent instant. Bobby Allison, his old mentor and now close friend, understood exactly what he was going through, because Allison had suffered his own career-ending head injury just 2 years earlier in 1988. Two men from the same small racing family, both permanently altered by the same kind of impact, trying to help each other piece their memories back together one conversation at a time. Doctors told Bonnett, in no uncertain terms, that his racing career was almost certainly finished. He could not be blamed for stepping away. The recovery itself was slow and strange in a way that is hard to fully picture unless you have lived through something similar. For the first several days, Bonnett could be introduced to the same close friend twice in one afternoon and have no memory of meeting them the first time. His long-term memories eventually returned in pieces over the following weeks, but the hours and days immediately surrounding the crash itself never came back to him at all. A permanent blank space in his own life story that no amount of recovery could fill in. Instead of walking away from motorsport entirely, though, Bonnett found a different way to stay close to the sport he loved. He became a TV commentator, working for TNN, CBS, and TBS, calling races and interviewing the same drivers he used to compete against. He hosted a show called Winners on TNN, profiling the personalities of the sport, and by every account, he was genuinely good at it. Warm and easygoing in a way that made him just as beloved off the track as he had been on it. He even picked up small acting roles along the way, appearing in the racing films Stroker Ace and Days of Thunder. To the outside world, Neil Bonnett looked like a man who had found a graceful, successful second act. Behind the scenes, though, something else was happening. The itch never actually left him in 1992. 2 years after the crash that nearly erased his own memories, Bonnett quietly began doing something that should have been a warning sign to anyone watching closely. He started driving cars during private test sessions for his close friend, Dale Earnhardt, ostensibly just to help develop the car's setup. But every driver who has ever tested a stock car knows exactly what that first lap back behind the wheel feels like after time away. And for a man with Bonnett's history, that first lap back should have felt like anything but routine. It clearly reignited something in him, because by 1993, Neil Bonnett was actively planning a real comeback to full-time Winston Cup competition, 3 full years after doctors had strongly suggested his career was over. That comeback nearly ended in tragedy almost immediately. In July of 1993, driving in the Die Hard 500 at Talladega Superspeedway, Bonnett's car got loose, flipped violently, went airborne, and tore through nearly 300 feet of the catch fence, separating the racetrack from the grandstands packed with fans. Eyewitnesses described the car cartwheeling through the air in a way that looked, for a few terrifying seconds, like it might clear the fence entirely and land among the spectators themselves. It was the kind of crash that, on a slightly different trajectory, could have caused a mass casualty event in the stands. Bonnett walked away from that wreck, physically unhurt. Most people, having already survived one career-threatening head injury, would have taken that violent, fence-shredding crash as an unmistakable sign to stop. Bonnett did not see it that way. He treated it as confirmation that he still belonged out there. He ran one more token lap in that year's season finale at Atlanta, and by the start of 1994, he had secured sponsorship to run at least the first 6 races of the season, beginning with the biggest stage in the entire sport, the Daytona 500. On February the 11th, 1994, Neil Bonnett climbed into his car for his very first practice session of the new season at Daytona, chasing a comeback that friends, family, and doctors alike had quietly hoped he would eventually let go of. NASCAR officials would later say his car may have hit a patch of oil on the track, though a follow-up inspection found no actual residue on the surface. And the sport's own spokesperson eventually described the likely cause simply as driver error. Whatever the precise trigger, Bonnett lost control of his Chevrolet, entering the high-banked 4th turn, swerved down onto the track apron, climbed back up the 31-degree banking, and slammed almost head-on into the outside wall. Track safety crews pulled him from the wreckage and rushed him to Halifax Medical Center, where he was listed in critical condition with severe head injuries. He was pronounced dead at 1:17 in the afternoon. What happened next reveals just how deeply this tragedy rippled through the entire sport. NASCAR officials did not announce Bonnett's death publicly until 5:24 that evening, more than 4 hours after he had already passed away. The reason was almost unbearably human. His wife, Susan, was still driving from their home in Hueytown, Alabama, toward Daytona Beach at the time of the crash, and officials refused to let the news break until she could be reached and told directly. Rather than finding out from a television broadcast or a stranger on the road, she did not learn that her husband was gone until she finally arrived at the track later that evening. And this tragedy, as devastating as it already was not even finished playing out that week. Just 3 days later, during that same round of Daytona 500 practice sessions, a young driver named Rodney Orr lost control of his own car, flipped, and was killed instantly when his car struck the catch fence. 2 fatal crashes in the same week at the same speedway. In the aftermath, veteran driver Jimmy Means, who had been at the track through both tragedies, announced his own retirement from driving, saying he had simply seen enough. The racing world's reaction to Bonnett's death went far beyond the usual outpouring that follows any driver's passing. This was a man who had already, in a sense, been given one miracle. He had survived a head injury doctors feared might permanently end who he was as a person, had clawed his way back to a functioning, respected life as one of television's most likable racing personalities, and then had chosen, with open eyes, to walk directly back toward the exact kind of danger that had nearly taken everything from him once already. For the extended Alabama gang family that Bonnett belonged to, this was simply one more entry in an almost unbearable pattern. Bobby Allison had already lost his own racing career to a head injury. He would go on to lose both of his sons to racing-related tragedies. His son Clifford killed in a 1992 crash, and his son Davey killed in a helicopter accident at Talladega in 1993. Ironically, while trying to watch Neil Bonnett's own son test a race car. It is genuinely difficult to find another small group of friends and family in the history of American motorsport who absorbed that much repeated tragedy in such a short span of years. In the years and decades that followed his death, the racing world made sure Neil Bonnett's contribution to the sport was never quietly forgotten. He was inducted into the National Motorsports Press Association Hall of Fame and the Alabama Sports Hall of Fame in 1997, just 3 years after his death. In 1998, NASCAR named him one of the 50 greatest drivers in the sport's first half-century of existence. The International Motorsports Hall of Fame inducted him in 2001. And the Motorsports Hall of Fame of America followed in 2012. As recently as 2023, nearly 3 decades after his death, NASCAR still considered him significant enough to include on its list of the 75 greatest drivers in the sport's history. These were not consolation honors handed out purely because he died young and tragically. Neil Bonnett earned 18 race wins and 20 pole positions across his career, numbers that stand on their own, with or without the story of how his life ended. It is worth sitting for a moment on just how unusual it was for a driver of Bonnett's stature, an 18-time race winner with a genuinely successful broadcasting career already built and waiting for him, to walk back toward the one thing that had already nearly cost him his identity. Most drivers who reach the safety of a TV booth after a career-threatening injury stay there, grateful for a second act that lets them remain close to the sport without risking their life for it. Bonnett had that exact situation handed to him, a respected role on TNN, CBS, and TBS, a hit show in winners, genuine affection from fans who loved him just as much behind a microphone as behind a wheel. And he chose to walk away from the safety of it anyway. That decision says something honest and complicated about what these drivers actually are, underneath the sponsorship logos and the interviews. For some of them, sitting safely in a broadcast booth talking about racing was never actually going to be enough. So why does this particular story cut so deep, more than 3 decades after that practice session at Daytona? Because Neil Bonnett's death was never really a story about bad luck, or a random mechanical failure, or a freak accident nobody could have predicted. Everyone around him, doctors, family, close friends who had lived through similar injuries themselves, had already told him exactly what could happen if he got back in that car. He was not naive about the risk. He understood it better than almost anyone else on Earth could have, because he had already lived through a preview of the worst-case outcome once before, waking up unable to recognize the people he loved most. And he chose to go back anyway, not out of arrogance, but because racing was simply who he was, in a way that a comfortable, successful career on television, however good he was at it, could never fully replace. That is what separates this story from a simple cautionary tale. Neil Bonnett was not a man who ignored a warning out of carelessness. He was a man who understood the warning completely and decided the risk was still worth it, right up until the moment it finally was not. Neil Bonnett climbed into that car at Daytona on February the 11th, 1994, the same way he had climbed into hundreds of cars before it, chasing one more shot at the sport that had already tried once to take everything from him. This time, it succeeded. He left behind his wife, Susan, and his 2 children, David and Kristen, along with a racing family in Alabama that had already absorbed more tragedy than any small group of friends should ever have to carry. He did not die because he was reckless. He died because some people simply cannot separate who they are from the thing that nearly killed them, even when every single person who loves them is begging them to try. If this story affected you even a fraction as much as researching it affected me, do us a favor and hit subscribe, because every single week on this channel we dig into another one of these stories, the crashes, the comebacks, and the decisions that shaped motorsport history and the safety rules every driver benefits from today. Thank you for watching, and we will see you in the next one.